Oh, crushes the mind.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Grab your last minute snacks. I'll just start. Welcome to the December quarterly meeting of the Smart Growth Network discussion, I believe we're calling them, because that's what it is. And that's what this new evolution of the Smart Growth Network, it kind of started 2 years ago. I appreciate its new incarnation and new format. And I've always gotten a lot out of them recently. So I appreciate the folks who came up with that. My name's Hugh Morris. I work here at the National Association of REALTORS. I manage the Smart Growth program here. Mostly what I do is I work through the roughly 1,100 local associations and give them all sorts of resources to get involved in their local areas, their communities with regard to land use and transportation public policy in an effort to drive development that meets as many of the 10 Smart Growth principles as possible. But we'll give them a grant even if they just get one of those. So, we work that, some of the things they work on are like zoning changes, to form-based codes, making the fiscal case for smart growth through sort of some of that work that Urban 3 does, and similar sort of financial cases, transit stuff. We've done some research with the American Public Transit Association around the benefits of being located near transit, and helped to fund some of the Opticos design work on missing middle in several locations, and also just Main Street revitalization. So those are sort of the big things that we sort of that our locals seem to gravitate towards doing. Here at 500 New Jersey Avenue, the Realtors built this building 20 years ago. And when it was built, it was the first LEED certified building in DC. A lot of that technology was kind of new. And just by way of example, they wanted to put in waterless urinals. At that time, those were not permitted under DC zoning code. So we had to go get a variance for that. And the technology was not necessarily proven. So they actually, while building the building, ran the water pipes in the wall in case they had to abandon the waterless urinals. So anyway, that's just sort of an example of when new things come along and how people embrace them, try to embrace them and adapt to them if they maybe sort of go haywire. But the building keeps evolving, right? Because we have to re-up our LEED certification every few years. So just 2 months ago, we flipped a switch on some vertical solar panels on the roof on 3 sides, so it catches sun all day long. And then also 40 little egg beater wind turbines. And so you put those together, and I think the idea is it's going to produce about 15% of the electricity we need here in the building. So that's kind of one of the fun things about working here, is seeing the building keep up with some of that technology. Just a couple of housekeeping items. The restrooms are here, one on either side of the elevator bank. You may have seen them already. Water, snacks, coffee, hot beverages down there. Most of you found those. The Wi-Fi, we have these if you want to join. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And we're going to be recording this meeting. And then I guess at the very end, so we're going to have these breakouts starting at 4. The elevators are going to be unlocked to take you all down to the 2nd floor for those of you who will go down there, and we'll get more into that, right? I guess. But I would just suggest on your way out at the end of the day, if you feel like stretching your legs, that you walk down this stairwell. It's quite a show. There's something there for all your senses. Anyway, I'll just tease it that way. Or you could just open the door, see if you like it and want to commit for 12 stories. And I think that's what I want to get.
Cards?
Pardon?
Index cards.
Well, I can talk about those.
Thank you. Yes, you know all about those.
Either way. So hi everybody. My name is Alina. I'm with the EPA Office of Community Revitalization, one of the coordinating organizations for the Smart Growth Network. Everyone who's sitting over here has an index card, and if you're online, Max is going to put like a link into the chat. We are looking for some input into how to run these meetings next year and what folks are interested in. So if you could jot down topics that you're interested in and or format ideas you might have, because we're happy to mix things up. If this is not working for you, please do jot it down during the meeting, and then we'll collect them at the end of the meeting if you want to just leave them at your desks. So the Smart Growth Network, for anyone who is new, and I think there are a couple of new people on the phone and maybe one or two in the room, is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working towards a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies that result in healthy, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous communities. So welcome to our quarterly discussion, the last one of 2024. We're going to have Ted Toon open us up. He is EPA's senior advisor on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Previously, he spent 20 years over at HUD, including directing FHA's multifamily mortgage division and designing the Green Retro program.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here representing the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The topic today, housing and sustainability and affordability, is something near and dear to my heart. As Lena said, I spent nearly 20 years at HUD, with some time at the White House Office of Management Budget, some time at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, but always working at this intersection of sustainability and housing, how to make that work. And I think the one thing that I've learned, and I think you probably all understand this, is that these are not competing goals. This is not a zero-sum game. We can do sustainability and we can do housing and affordability. They are not competing goals, they are complementary goals. And we really need to think about, from a policy perspective and a program perspective, how we marry those and make them work together, as opposed to allowing them to be competing for the same dollars and resources. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, for those who are not familiar with it, should be one resource that helps in the housing market. It can help both develop and retrofit housing. It's a $27 billion program that was authorized under the Inflation Reduction Act. EPA is running the program with three goals in mind. One is, of course, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as the name would indicate. The second is really ensuring that the program delivers co-benefits, the kinds of things that American households and communities can really feel. So whether that's lower utility bills, lower housing costs overall, whether it's cleaner indoor air quality, better outdoor air quality, all the kind of tangible benefits that you can get along with greenhouse gas reductions. And the third goal of the program is to attract private capital into the market. I think one thing that all of us know who work in this space is there's never enough money to do this work. There's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines waiting to come in if they know it's a safe space to invest. And so what this fund wants to do is attract that money in, to commingle our money, if you will, to make it a safer space for private capital to come in. Because once that financing stream begins, that's something that can be sustaining and permanent. But not only the housing is sustainable, but the financing stream for doing the work is sustainable. I think that is the long-term goal of the program. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is actually three distinct programs. They are related and complementary programs, but you should be aware of all three of them. The first is what's called the Solar for All program. It's a $7 billion program to deliver solar to low-income communities. We've selected 60 intermediaries who are going to run that program for us, just because the solar markets are so localized in terms of utility regulation and community solar and connectivity laws and all that kind of thing. We wanted to make sure that we were picking partners that had that local expertise. That's the first program. The second is $14 billion National Clean Investment Fund. For that program, we have selected three national nonprofit intermediaries who will be administering the program on our behalf. It's a big kind of a green bank kind of a program that will be funding programs nationally. The third program is the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. It's a $6 billion program. This is really a pass-through program to local community lenders. So we've selected 5 intermediaries, but they're passing through at least 90% of that financing to local community lenders. Think credit unions, green banks, minority depository institutions, credit unions, the kind of institutions that already have community relationships and probably best understand how to serve their communities. So those are the 3 programs. Couple of things. All 3 of those programs are just now rolling out. We have just finalized our grant agreements with those 68 grantees across those 3 programs. So they are just now beginning to roll their programs out into the communities. over the coming weeks and months. A lot more detail about the product offerings and the kinds of things that they will finance will be becoming available. What I can tell you is that the housing sector should be well represented here. In the Solar for All program, all of those projects have to have a residential nexus to them. So either the solar have to be on a residential property, single family, multifamily, manufactured home, or if you're doing community solar, the benefits through net metering have to go to low income residents. So it has to be a residential nexus. The other two programs, the National Clean Investment Fund, Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. For both of those programs, we told our recipients that there are three priority project categories. One being distributed generation of energy, second is zero emissions transportation, and the third is the building sector, whether it's new construction of net zero buildings or the deep retrofit of existing buildings to make them significantly more energy efficient. I can tell you that across our applicants, now grantees, more than 50% of the funding will go towards the building sector. So 50% of that 20 billion plus the entire 7 billion of Solar for All, more than $17 billion will be going toward the building sector. Second point to be aware of is that a majority of the funding is targeted to low income and disadvantaged communities. We've defined what that means for our program purposes, and one of the definitions specifically calls out housing and affordable housing as one of the eligible criteria that meets that definition. Two final things. One is that those two programs, National Clean Investment Fund, Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, are generally going to be loan programs that will be lending to projects. There's some technical assistance and other things that may be in the form of grants, but generally those are going to be loan programs. The Solar for All program, however, will be a mix of grants and loans, in fact, skewed towards grants, depending on which state and which recipient. So be aware of that. Finally, all of these selectees, all of these grantees who will be running the program, they are all listed on our website, the GGRF website for EPA, along with a little bit of their program plan and what they're planning to do with the funds and contact information so you know how to reach them. So I highly encourage you to go on, find out who the recipients are, who's in the areas that you serve, et cetera. Lastly, I'll just make a plug for the website. Lots of great information on there about the programs. Again, these things are just beginning to roll out over the next quarter, so you should be seeing a lot more information there. So glad to be here, looking forward to the discussion, and really looking forward to how our fund can help support the mission and the goals that this organization is promoting.
Thanks, Ted. I'm really glad that you were able to join us today. I'm going to pass the mic, so to speak, along to Calvin Gladney, who is the president and CEO of Smart Growth America since 2018.
Since 2018, yes, indeed. Feels like both longer and shorter. Good to see both old faces and new faces. And with just a couple of minutes, I want to make 2 points. One, a point of policy in this moment, and a point of practice. So in terms of policy, let's do a little call and response really quickly. So more housing in the right places. More housing in the right places. So I know we're going to have a conversation about housing supply, and there's lots of organizations and research and work that basically seems to say, let's just get more housing wherever we can get it. And if you're taking a smart growth approach, it's a yes and. We want more housing in the right places where there are jobs, where there are amenities, where there's existing infrastructure. It's bad fiscal policy to put housing too far away from existing infrastructure, jobs, services, schools, healthcare. Policy. And as Smart Growth America, we've been working on these things in a variety of ways. So we actually, on the advocacy side, have just joined some of you, and maybe by raise of hands, Congressman Garcia out of California just started the YIMBY caucus. And we are working with that caucus, both behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. And that's a pro-housing caucus. And hopefully, right now it's in the House, so it's not in the Senate, but hopefully it becomes bicameral and we really, from that standpoint, start to see federal housing policy that gets us to more supply as we just deal with kind of a sheer crisis, not just in affordable housing, but just in housing in general. If you make $125,000 a year, in many cities, you're still struggling to find affordable housing, even though you don't mean that in the technical sense. Beyond the YIMBY caucus, we also, as many of you may have heard, just launched a new center called the Center for Zoning Solutions, CZS. I like to say that zoning is like the invisible infrastructure of everything we want to do. It's almost like we're a fish in water and we don't realize that it's zoning. And some of our lawyers and former lawyers in the audience know what I'm talking about. Really dictates what we actually can pull off. And so as we talk about all of this policy work on housing supply, if you don't get the zoning right, and unfortunately the challenge with zoning is there's not one zoning law around the country, you really need to block and tackle and almost create a movement that then has zoning reform custom fit to that city, that state. You might have state, local conflicts. So you really need, I said this to someone the other day, the problem with zoning reform is it's like we have a congregation with no hymnals, right? Like everybody knows we need zoning reform, but everyone's like, well, how do we do that? What do we do? We can't do what was done in California. We can't do what was done in Minnesota. What is the right way? And so part of what we want to do as CZS is really start a movement that has some principles, has some through line of best and leading practices, and get those around the country. And then you take them to your neck of the woods and fight your fights. Finally, we've been working with HUD and just published a guidebook that really brings some evidence and data and some backing on how to do zoning reform and again, how to custom fit it around the country. So you can Google that and find that. It's on the HUD Exchange. Hopefully the HUD Exchange makes it into the next world. And so we've been really fighting just from a policy standpoint to say, let's make sure that policy allows us to get the housing supply, but again, not just housing, but housing in the right places. But I said I also wanted to make a practice point. And I think this is going to be true for all of our organizations in kind of whatever is coming next as political regimes and powers change. We're going to have to all say to ourselves, do we want to be right or do we want to make an impact? Do we want to be right and get all the right words in, make sure it says equity, make sure it talks about climate, or do we want to get some of the policies and work across all the aisles and get things done? As organizations, as people, we're going to have to think about whether we just want to be the loudest people in the room or we actually want to move the needle on housing and housing supply. And I just wanted to plant that seed because I do think we could have all the right policies and maybe push for things that are perfect. And as you know from that saying, some of that perfect be the enemy of the good. So just wanted to also mention that in this next go round, there's going to be a lot of fights, a lot of advocacy, a lot of policy questions. And we're really going to have to think about that balance of what we push on, what vocabulary we use, but how do we, at the end of the day, get some wins for the right people, for the right housing in the right place. Thank you.
Thanks, Calvin. Okay, so I think we're going to move into our panel discussion, and it is going to be moderated by Lauren Lowry, who is the Director of Housing and Community Development from the National League of Cities.
Thank you. As stated before, my name is Lauren Lowry, the Director of Housing and Community Development at National League of Cities. If you are not familiar with National League of Cities, we are the voice of cities, towns, and villages across the U.S. And I'll be moderating today's discussion on strategies to boost the supply and improve the quality of affordable, resilient housing. It may not be a surprise to anyone in the room or virtually, but housing supply is and the top priority for cities and communities across the U.S. Nationally, there is a shortage of roughly 4 million units, but within that crisis, many affordable housing units are deteriorating because of age. And as the units are deteriorating, it becomes increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate risk. So for our discussion today, we will focus on how communities have and can promote resilience in the face of future natural disasters, by one, expanding the supply of high quality, resilient, affordable housing, and then two, preserving, retrofitting, and sustaining existing supply of housing. And as housekeeping today, when I talk about affordable housing, I'm describing big A, affordable housing, which is housing units that are subsidized publicly, and small A, affordable housing, consider housing priced at no more than 30% of a household budget. Either way, we have a crisis. And so this gets to the heart of this discussion around supply. And to kind of kick it off, I wanted to talk about the work that I'm currently doing at the National League of Cities. Perfect. So at the National League of Cities, I co-lead the Housing Supply Accelerator. And if you are not familiar with the Housing Supply Accelerator, it's a partnership between National League of Cities and the American Planning Association. Our goal was to help communities tackle their housing supply challenges. And more specifically, we wanted to work with communities to identify housing supplies solutions that expand, preserve, and improve the quantity and quality of housing. And to do this, we wanted to be very, I wouldn't say different, but we wanted to align the efforts of public and private stakeholders. More specifically, we all know there's a housing problem, but we talk at each other. We don't listen. We want to get our point across. And so with this effort, what we thought to do is to create a table so that we can listen to one another. More specifically, we brought together local governments, community planners, builders, developers, financial institutions, state and federal partners, and housing policy organizations to make change at the local level. And we did this using a steering committee, and we worked along our core partners, which included the National Association of Home Builders, the National Association of Realtors, and the Mortgage Banker Association. And we didn't have conversation up until a year ago with each other because honestly, we're not talking with one another. So those were some interesting conversations to begin this conversation around housing supply. And we want to be very narrow and focused because when talking about housing, I could talk about evictions, I could talk about homelessness, I could talk about housing stability, but it all goes back to supply. So we were very intentional about the ways that we can focus on preservation, production, and improving. And in those conversations, we set off and we had 4 convenings roughly, where we focused on the components of housing supply. We focused on construction development, we focused on housing finance, we focused on land use and regulation, and infrastructure and workforce challenges related to housing supply. Because even if we were to change zoning today, we have a workforce shortage. We can't build housing. Even if we fix the workforce shortage today, there's not enough funding. Right? And so we really wanted to look at the whole system of housing supply. And out of those conversations, we were able to deliver the Housing Supply Playbook, which is a resource designed for communities. And I will preface this is not a one size fits all. Every community is different. This playbook is to serve as inspiration. As a former city staffer, I wish I had a playbook to begin with when I was tackling housing issues. This is to begin the conversation, but also to create an environment of collaboration. And some key insights in the playbook is 1, there's so many challenges and they have to work together. So we really emphasized a system approach, where as we're trying to address challenges in construction and development, we're also addressing challenges in finance and land use and regulation and infrastructure and workforce. Also, there's not one solution to address the housing supply crisis. It's going to be multi-layered, and it's going to take all the stakeholders working together. And then finally, we need an actionable level of consensus, not perfect consensus, to address the housing supply crisis. And thus far, our impact has been wide-reaching. As we have rolled this out in May, we've seen work. Recently, I've seen Delaware release their own housing supply accelerator. I've seen New Mexico roll out something around the housing supply accelerator, as well as Connecticut. We're seeing cities really taking the model of what we mapped out and, instituting their own local housing supply accelerator. And our goal is, one, to capture those stories to show the impact that is being made, but also it's not just the playbook to read. So we're in the process of releasing additional resources and tools for communities across the US. And online, you will receive a one-pager as well, but please check out the Housing Supply Accelerator and take it to a community near you. So with that, that was a perfect segue to kick off the panel discussion. So my first question to the panel, tell us about yourself, what you do, and how does resiliency factor into your work?
Hi, everybody. My name is Maia Shanklin Roberts. I am my title Vice President of Real Estate Development for Preservation of Affordable Housing. POA is a national nonprofit organization based in Boston. We kind of cut our teeth in the industry, starting with acquisition rehab, but have now expanded to doing a lot more new construction work. And we own, operate, and manage all of our properties. So we see housing from both, supply, construction and creation, production, to the preservation of it, the full life cycle of a property or asset. I am based here in Washington, D.C., and I manage our D.C. portfolio. And right now, our big focus here locally is the redevelopment of Berry Farm, which was a former public housing community in Southeast D.C. That was a community of about 400 public housing units and will become a community of about 1,000 both rental and for sale units with about 40,000 square feet of commercial space. And we're both building vertically, but we're also doing all new horizontal infrastructure as well. And so resiliency is a huge part of my day-to-day in thinking about how do we make this community a resilient, sustainable community. In all facets of resiliency, from the actual construction and design, but also thinking about what does this project look like 99 years later, or generations later, because what we're doing is creating that impact for this neighborhood.
Yeah, so good afternoon. I'm Danilo Pelletier. I'm the see if I can get this right, the Multifamily Investments Director in the Office of Recapitalization, then the Office of Housing at HUD. And what that really means is I am sort of overseeing the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program implementation. So that is another Inflation Reduction Act program that is about $840 million program that invests in existing privately owned HUD-assisted housing. So think of often as project-based Section 8 housing. And so what we are doing, we've got 3 different programs. One is a program that goes up to about $750,000. And sort of if you're doing a recapitalization of one of those projects, you can ask for our money to sort of do more, right? So to do better HVAC or get your insulation, your ceiling, air sealing, and these sorts of things, take it to the next level. Then we have a cohort, as we call it, called Leading Edge. And that's sort of an innovative program. It's sort of public policy 101. We're going to pay you to get a green, sort of a net zero, essentially, green certification. And so we're going to help you with up to $10 million. And you're going to, sort of commit to getting that certification. And how you do that is up to you and your architect, but that's what we're in for. And then we have another cohort up to $20 million, which is the comprehensive cohort. And that's where we take properties sort of designed maybe for maybe a little less sophisticated owners or for owners of properties that have a lot of things that they need to take care of. And we assign them what we call a multifamily assistance contractor who works with them to do a integrated design sort of approach to make sure that they're covering both their needs and maximizing the amount of energy efficiency and resiliency work that they do. So obviously it is the green and resilient retrofit program. And so we do a lot of work around resiliency, sort of as it's commonly understood in terms of generators, fortified roofs, potentially lifting properties even, or in some cases, potentially thinking of moving sort of a property, or at least the assistance to a new property. And we've got some of that is occurring. And then obviously the efficiency aspect, which and the affordability aspect of these properties already, which are also resiliency tools. And so resiliency is really in everything that we do in the Green and Resilient retrofit program. And as of now, we've closed 16 projects, mostly in the smaller elements cohort because they're the furthest along. And we're in the completion stage of 2 of those. And we're just going to keep going. We've got about 270 projects right now with the current round of funding that we're going to be able.
Thank you. And for our last panelist.
Hi, Sahar. Let me turn on my camera so it's not awkward as the only person that is not in the room. And I apologize if there is any background noise here. It's bowling day in the office, so people are kind of going crazy outside. But yes, Sahar Soltani, I am the Director of Housing Finance at Mutual Housing California. We are a local nonprofit affordable housing developer here in the Sacramento region. We've been around for about 30 years, started as a tenant organization group and advocacy group, and quickly grew into a development company. And within the last 5 to 7 years, we've really ramped up new construction. So really, housing production is front of mind for us throughout. We are, developers, property managers, so we hold and maintain our projects long term, and that's where sustainability becomes really critical to what we do and to the health of our projects. I couldn't agree more with, I believe it was Ted at the beginning of the meeting that mentioned housing production and sustainability are complementary goals, and we really take that into heart because it is twofold for us. It's the long-term operational health of the project, and that means it's financial health as well as health and well-being of our residents. And then it's the short term is kind of staying ahead of the curve and being more competitive in a lot of the sources that are available for affordable housing production, and trying to be the leader and acknowledging that sustainability needs to be part of the discussion, and it's not really an obstacle, although, over the years in the industry, that's how it's been viewed, because when you mention sustainability, immediately the first thing that comes to mind is increased cost. However, there are ways to look beyond that. And for us, really how it plays into our work, for instance, we have pledged to the Better Climate Challenge. Just like setting the goals and putting them in front of us is a huge part of the first step that needs to be taken. Communicating those goals to all of our partners. This includes the design teams, the construction teams, and making sure that we are taking steps, even small, to get to the goals that we are setting as far as sustainability and resiliency. And thank you so much for bringing me into this conversation.
Thank you. And any panelist can pick up on this first question. So let's talk about the supply of housing in the United States. Why is supply not keeping up with demand, and how is this compounded by climate risk? And what are the major barriers to developing affordable housing today?
I mean, I can jump in. So I mean, again, like obviously I teach a course at Georgetown for a semester where this is what we cover. So answering it here is difficult. I think that, in the US today, and Calvin already brought this up, we do have a situation in which building housing has become much more difficult than it was in the past. Now, part of that is just simply we've reached the frontier, the amount of we have lots of land, that's not the point, but around cities and these sorts of things, the availability of land and the money for infrastructure and these sorts of things have become much more difficult. But then part of it is that we have also zoned and regulated ourselves. Now, to be clear, I think if you're having trouble, you said someone was saying that up to 125% or $125,000, people are having difficulty affording. But I do think that if you've got difficulty with your middle income folks affording housing, that is clearly a regulatory and policy issue. There is another set of affordability things that is low income. And there are always going to be people with us who are not going to be able to sort of afford and maintain, which is something else we'll talk about, sort of depreciation and these sorts of things, affordable housing that is of a community standard. So if we're not comfortable with people being homeless, if we're not comfortable with people in favelas and tenements and these sorts of things, we've got to come up with policies, essentially subsidies, that are going to allow us to create that housing. Now, if we build more housing and make it possible to build more housing and are able to serve that middle income group better, it's also going to make it easier to do lower income housing. But the two things are different problems. So.
And I think too, just will add, I think we have to start with whether or not it's commonly and universally agreed that housing is a right. Unless we're starting from that premise, we won't develop the policies or the modify regulations to be able to produce housing, right? I think we all know that if you have workforce, funding, and land, we can create. But the reasons why we don't is because there isn't, I think, that will to be able to provide housing for those who are most at need and can't do it for themselves, and be very creative. And so I think, there are tons of practical things, but the first thing I would start on, we're not starting from the same premise.
And do you have anything to add?
Sure. Yeah. I think I can kind of bring it a little more into the context of what we are seeing as obstacles coming up because of climate change and sustainability issues. And one of them that is front of mind here in California now is significantly the insurance costs, for instance. And those have skyrocketed, 2-3 times folded on new construction projects. We've had insurance companies leave the state, and it's mostly due to really high fire risk areas and the major wildfires that happened along the state. So that kind of shows how the work of in the field of environmental resiliency and sustainability really directly can have an impact on an overall industry. So that's just one example. But I would agree with the funding being one of the most challenging issues, especially for the capital A affordable, as we were talking about the income rent restricted, regulated, subsidized affordable housing. And the legislative uncertainty usually drives that. So depending on, different timelines, it's hard to keep up with the production. And that's why we see a lot of curves of, high points when there's a new bond measure locally, or if there is new federal funding coming in. And then we see the dip when competition increases so much for those funds that it cannot keep up anymore with the demand for production.
Thank you. Just to repeat, some of the factors that have been talked about has been infrastructure, regulatory issues, workforce, finance. I'm surprised I didn't hear about community opposition. And you did mention state preemption, but as we talk about those factors that already been discussed, the affordable housing stock is also at risk of deterioration with time as maintenance costs are increasingly rising alongside climate-related risks. With any of the panelists, what is your experience? What is in your experience being done to address the maintenance challenges facing older buildings?
Yeah, I mean, I think HUD's program has been super helpful and innovative. I know POA, we have applied and received a number of awards for a lot of our older properties in our portfolio. And without it, I'm not sure that we would have a path forward, to be honest. Rising construction costs, but on top of zoning changes that are forward thinking, right? And love it. We want better, greener buildings, but to take those buildings who are already have very low rents to this newer standard is very difficult without proper subsidy. And I think, timing is working down that this funding has come about, but it also is, there's other factors that disable many of our properties from being able to take advantage of it, right? So we might want to recapitalize, but we have tons of rent arrears. So then we're trying to get tenants to pay rent, and like, how do you support that effort to be able to get us into a place where we can move forward? So I think there's especially with affordable housing, there's so many different factors that affect our ability to take an older property, which means more than likely your residents are more vulnerable, which means the community is most vulnerable to meet like very modern standards, which of course are better for this building or this community in general. And the subsidy needs is just not there yet.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important to sort of recognize. I mean, a lot of the way we produce affordable housing in this country is depreciation, right? That's the filtering that you hear about in an economics course or whatever. But ultimately, there comes a point where it's no longer what we consider decent housing. It's no longer habitable, right? And in the resiliency discussion, I've seen walls blow over because the mortar's gone, right? The roofs fall in. Obviously, heat and other things are lacking. And from putting on sort of a hat from a previous job, I think we also tend to focus on sort of affordable housing or multifamily housing. For a city, I used to be the preservation officer here in DC, and I ran a program called Single Family Rehab. That is one of the most difficult things we face, is declining single family homes, elderly folks in single family homes that are deteriorating around them. And that's the only home they can afford. They can't really move. If they sell, yes, they can get a decent amount of money in a place like DC, but it's not enough, right? And if the house is falling down, it's losing value for their heirs. And we don't tend to focus on it because, again, home ownership, we tend to sort of say, oh, you're a homeowner, good, close the door, we're done, right? And that's not, in fact, what a lot of cities are experiencing. So this question of deterioration, which is in some ways, again, a good thing for affordable housing, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. As new housing is built, people move into that frees up other housing, et cetera. Eventually, though, it's a real problem, and you have to recapitalize. You have to do something with that property, and that takes funds. And so, yeah, it's a significant issue, and one that, and again, it's also condos and co-ops. Huge problem with condos and co-ops, and the governance issues there make it very difficult often to do what you need to do to bring that property back up to code. So anyways, in my program in HUD, obviously we're addressing it directly and trying for the first time. HUD has not for many years had this kind of money to invest in properties. And so it's very exciting to do, but it does take a lot of work and a lot of money.
I'll just add that, so I think, two things. One is, for instance, the GGRS funding that is going to be available and we're anxiously waiting for. the guidelines on how the money is going to be distributed to come out. And that is going to play a huge role on revamping the existing or adding new solar to a lot of the existing portfolio. And that really is a direct impact on the residents. You know, our goal is to bring their utility bill down to zero, and that way allow them more comfort, you know, in their day-to-day lives. And this funding becoming available is going to be a big game changer in that sense. But in the more non-conventional maybe ways, what we've been looking at is really collaborating with innovative and research and development groups. So for instance, the UC Davis here locally was working on a new program, part of their research team on new attic insulation systems. What that allowed us, it was bringing brand new attic insulation to an older property that was more than 15 years old, and that significantly decreased the air leakage in the unit. That's going to directly translate into savings for the tenants, and it's going to provide, you know, better thermal comfort, especially as we go into, you know, really having these ups and downs of really hot days here in Sacramento. And cold days are not much of an issue here, but those are kind of some ways that we are trying to get ahead of this problem, because to the point that the other panelists made, the funding for preservation or rehab is limited. It's limited at state level, and it's limited at the federal level, and it's the portfolio that is competing for it is quite large.
Lauren, can I make one more point? Just sort of the resiliency theme and sort of severe weather events. That's a big thing that folks often don't recognize. Like, you know, again, if you think of New Orleans before Katrina, a lot of that housing was relatively affordable, and that was largely because of, you know, 300 years of depreciation. When that housing gets wiped out, you've got to rebuild it. That means all that you've got to start over with a new today dollar amount, and that then, you know, to your point, makes it very hard to bring it back as affordable. Where, you know, so you've got a whole huge stock often in these fires or storms or these sorts of things that gets lost, and it's not, you don't just sort of rebuild it. It won't be as affordable when you do.
And pulling on that thread, how are developers rising to the challenge nationwide? And what are the most effective design strategies? And what do residents most need and appreciate?
I'll start with your last question, because, you know, speaking to residents about resiliency, energy efficiency is like, that's all the way up here, and we have to get really, really practical with them. So it's about, how does this affect the utilities that I'm paying? You know, does this impact, you know, how I feel in my unit? And so, for example, we just delivered our first senior building at Berry Farms, the Asbury, and a lot of the residents wanted balconies. They wanted to be able to come out on, you know, and see outside, and they wanted windows that can open all the way up. But we've designed it to meet passive house standards. And so there's not going to be balconies, and the windows are not going to open in the way that they want them to. We're not going to have a fancy, you know, ground floor with, you know, all of the more funky, you know, and fun amenities, because what is important to us is to have a very highly energy efficient building. We even, for example, did induction stoves, right? And provide them with the cookware for it, right? So it is this, you know, trying to support them in understanding what our goals are, but also, you know, talking about like what this direct impact. Does this affect your day-to-day? Does this affect your bottom line? Is what, you know, is the messaging to them that helps us to be able to talk or open the door to greater conversations about things that are less tangible, and does it directly impact them? I'm kind of losing the other question, but that is kind of what we're doing, right? So as an organization, we've made it a standard and a goal that all of our properties will be built at least to passive house standards, right? So that is universal. We're going to do solar everywhere, and we will find the resources to fund it. That is just a commitment that we have to make, regardless of what the building code says, because in DC is pushing for net zero. And so we're often in a currently, I'm fighting to say that passive house, based on what you guys now currently have in the code, is exceeds that. And I know that is not written, but we want to do it. We're going to fight for it and we're going to pay for it, right? And it takes those types of investments and commitment from developers to say that it's like sustainability first, because we can understand those impacts despite what residents and communities want to see, because sometimes they're not yet able to appreciate the benefits of those things. Because I could go to a resident meeting, and if I listened and heard them and said, we have to have balconies in this building, we would have designed a very different building, right? And it would not have had all of this, technology that allows for greater resiliency. And so I think that is like the dance that you have to do now as a developer, in terms of trying to convey that there are these larger goals, and maybe you can't realize it today, but you will, and that is our work.
Yeah. Anyone else want to answer that?
I guess what I would say is that that's one of the exciting things about the Green and Resilient Retrofit program, is that we are trying these different ways of trying to get at some more things. And we've got a lot of folks in our comprehensive program. They're working with those MACs, and they're trying to do integrated design, and there's very different projects and very different owners all across the country. And so part of it is a research program to learn about how this works and what works, and what we end up with, these different processes. So part of it is, our MACs are asking residents as part of resident engagement, what do you want to see in the building? And sure enough, it is a disconnect between, the things that you would see watching HGTV or other just, things that you want in your home versus what is possible. And they're going to have to walk that line with their consultant to figure out what they can do. So it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of it.
Yeah. And Sahar, what specific local, state, and federal programs have made a real difference for developers of affordable housing?
I'll just add one more thing to the piece that we were talking about earlier, and that is really educating the residents plays a huge role. So having a team on site where they can translate what these efficiency measures really mean, and moving the risk onto the developer or the owner, and just allowing the residents to kind of absorb the benefit of having lower utility bills and having better comfort in their units plays a huge role. In Sacramento, for instance, I think Maya mentioned like induction cooktops. So the utility companies play a huge role. The utility provider here, the electricity provider, they kind of stayed ahead of a lot of the state and the national goals, and they were incentivizing all electric buildings and switching, to induction cooktops and making sure no gas is piped into new development projects way ahead of it became a requirement statewide. And that was very helpful to really test that out ahead of, having to just play catch up with new building code or new requirements. So that's a very local example of it. At the state level, I would say that the current administration made a huge push to make sure that new development projects are going in areas that have great access to amenities, to really good schools. So there is the resource area mapping that happens in California, and projects, especially affordable housing family projects, are incentivized and become more competitive to receive funds if they are located within these high resource areas. So that was one move that the administration took in order to make sure that these projects are not just being put in place. It's not just housing production, it's housing production in the right place. I believe someone mentioned that early on in the meeting. Those are two examples that come to mind, but I'm sure there are more on the national level as the team has been discussing.
Yeah, and before we wrap up the moderated question portion of this discussion, did any other panelists wanted to speak to a specific local, state, or federal programs that made a real difference? No. Okay.
Open GRP is gonna.
Yeah. So at this time, we'll take questions from the audience. And as we're percolating to see who has the question, I think one of the questions I want to ask is, what additional key partners should be brought into this important work of building resilience into affordable housing, and who else would benefit from being at the table in the conversation at the start of these projects?
We've already mentioned the residents. I think, again, we talked about sort of balance there that can happen between NIMBY on one hand and sort of desires from tenants or others that are maybe, but you do have to do that. I mean, that's really one of the most important things. In GRP, we require sort of, a lot of resident engagement up front. So that's, really one of the most important things. And then the other one is a lot of our elected officials and others making the rules. They kind of have to understand these things in order to make good policy.
I would say construction. We are doing a lot of on-site education of our general contractors and subs. For the first two buildings at Berry, we, as I mentioned, joined Passive House, but our GC that we selected, big GC and DC, have only done one or two other buildings. And so the amount of education that we've had to do just in terms of even our architects, right? Like not designing, making sure there was sufficient insulation, making sure that they're not like over designing or under designing, took a lot of work. And we engaged a Passive House consultant just to make sure that that started with us during the design process and did CA to make sure that we achieved our goal. But that consultant is a unique person, right? And there is not enough persons to be able to do that work. And I think when we talk about workforce and the need to increase workforce, it's increase the capacity of persons, both from the individual laborer up to the company itself, who knows how to implement this technology. And there is a lot of work that they need to do to be able to, get on board.
Yes, I thought that was a really great point. Any other partners?
I would add, for instance, we are transitioning our entire pipeline to factory-built ZNE or passive house housing. And although factory-built housing has been around for a long time, there hasn't been a lot of push from the building industry to make sure that the housing manufacturers are, up to speed on these ambitious energy goals or sustainability goals. So for us, right now, they are, the various factories that we are looking at, we've brought them on way early on and started these conversations to realize what that would mean for the production and the timing and the abilities of these factories to be able to catch up to the sustainability measures. So it just goes back to, educating the different parties that are involved based on the nature of the project.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Quiet. So my next question is, what tools would be the most helpful to you in continuing to advance this work? And what would you want others to know when they're starting this work?
Overall development, you mean, or sustainability?
I think just affordable housing and building a resilient product.
Yeah, I think just recognizing that what the housing production is, the product of this work has a very long lifetime, and we can see that within really 10 to 15 years, there are points where if things are missed or things are not intentionally set up for long-term success, it's going to cause issues if it comes to maintenance, upkeep, or rehabilitation of these properties. So it's really important to bring all the parties together really early on. Outreach to residents is a huge part of it. And the information that you can gather from the lived experiences, it becomes critical when you are developing how you can better the ways and means by which you go about housing production.
I would also say just remembering that funding is central, right, to the creation of what we're doing, and no policy should not have that component. So if you are thinking of something that doesn't, and you haven't figured out how are you going to get dollars to it, like stop thinking about it. I mean, because it really is central, and I think from state, local, federal level, there are a number of great ideas, but not really knowing, how an affordable housing product pencils, and how it actually is financed to know like what we can or cannot do is important. And so I do, I loved your last slide with all the folks at the table, but I think a lot of times, especially with the big A affordable developers, these types of sustainable, resilient goals are imposed on us. And then we're asked to meet them, and the funding hasn't caught up. And so I would just say that, just really digging deep and ensuring that policy and dollars are always paired, and that those dollars are realistic, and actually support the actual product that we're creating is key. And so to the extent that practitioners need to be in the conversation, I think we would welcome that, because we too are, committed to the same goals.
And I would just
I was
add,
just saying, just quickly on that, I think one thing to recognize there is this with the funding, and I've been on various sides of that conversation. But if you don't do that, one thing is projects don't happen or they don't get rehabbed or that sort of thing. The other side of it, though, is if you've ever actually had experience with affordable housing development, you know how insane the financing can be. And that means that folks like me are spending a huge amount of time paying consultants, paying lawyers, others to bring together an insane variety of funding to make it work. And so that's another thing just to recognize, is that oftentimes things are sort of like, well, we'll have a little funding, or we'll just sort of put this in and it'll fund itself. That doesn't really happen that way. And that's what's exciting about this program that I'm in, is that it tends to be sort of a significant investment that can really maybe fund a lot of the stuff that we're asking folks to do. But even so, it's just, if this is sort of getting to know sort of what practitioners have to go through. I don't think there's any more sophisticated sort of financing, I don't think, derivatives, international currency, whatever, than affordable housing. And that shouldn't be that way. It's a real inefficient way to do things.
yeah, and just to talk about funding, at least from a local perspective, ARPA, the American Rescue Act, gave local governments, I think, roughly like $65 billion. About 6.7 billion, or 12%, went to housing related, and this is housing related activities that predates COVID, right? So we're just still catching up from the 2008 recession. And that investment was bigger than the home investment program, I think, over the last 10 years. So we have a lot of catching up to do. And I think it's important that, yes, having policy is good, but not having funding, it's not going to be successful. And I would also say what would be most helpful, inviting local leaders in. And also there needs to be the assumption that not every local leader is a houser, right? Or sustainability. So there's going to have to be a lot of education that happens frequently with local elected officials who want to get in on this. If I could say anything out of this panel discussion, housing is a top priority for local leaders. They're trying to figure out how to pencil it out. The biggest question I get is, where's the money, right? So let me make this easy, right? And they want to address issues for all of their constituents. And so with that, I would like to wrap up today's panel discussion and pass it over.